And as promised, we are joined by Casey Holdahl, who covers the Blazers, beat reporter and insider. Casey, thank you so much for joining us. Reached out and happy you could hop on the show to talk about your Blazers. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How you doing?
Good. Casey, let's start here, as we really wanted to talk to you because of where the Blazers are at in this rebuilding process. As the Kings, as you know, they've been through a lot, and trying to figure out what the path should be next for the Sacramento Kings. Right now, Casey, what would you say is the feeling on the direction of the Portland Trail Blazers?
I feel like, this season, more so than last season, and I think maybe for the first time in a couple seasons. I mean, because, obviously, you get to the end of the Damian Lillard kind of era in Portland, and you kind of, even the last year he was there, you could kind of see which direction it was going. Mm-hmm. And so, then that obviously, when you trade a player like Dame, that's going to, if you were kind of rebuilding before, which I feel like the Blazers were, that really kind of throws your rebuild into kind of full motion, because, you're basically stating like, yeah, we're going to trade our best player and kind of, reassess. Mm-hmm. And so, I would say that this year, particularly in the second half of this season, I think it's probably the first time that the fan base in the last couple of years probably looks at the team and says, like, okay, like I see the direction they're going. The last year was kind of just a straight up acquisition mode. Let's get players, and however things shake out on the court, that's going to be what it is. But this year, it actually seemed like, they were actually playing to win, while a lot of teams this season have gone the other direction with such a great draft coming up. The Blazers have really gone out there and tried to improve on the court by winning. And, by making some of the moves they made in the offseason, last year. So getting Deni Avdija, bringing in DeAndre Ayton, getting Toumani Camara in that trade with DeAndre Ayton. And then, drafting Scoot, I think and then drafting Donovan Clingan last year, I think, you're starting to kind of see the bones of where they want this roster to get to. You add in Shaedon Sharpe there as well. So I would say they're kind of in the early middle of their rebuild. I think, it's still a few seasons away, but I think in terms of like at least having a product on the floor that on a night-to-night basis could conceivably win games, I think that's kind of where they're at now, whereas before last year it was like, hey, if they're not going to lose by 20, that feels like kind of a victory. So they're getting more competitive while also still adding talent is where they're at, I would say.
So there are a couple names on the Blazers that come up every trade season, and they haven't moved yet, right? So the DeAndre Aytons of the world, the Jeremy Grants of the world, does this offseason feel like the offseason that they might get moved, or is it just not going to happen?
I could see anything happening this offseason. I do think, kind of to your broader points, they are getting to the point where it's like, they've done the, having veterans while having young players as well, and it's worked. But I also do think that at a certain point in time, you probably got to kind of make some decisions on some guys and live with the results. I think that, they have been aggressive from everything I can tell, everything I've heard for the last couple of seasons, particularly at the deadlines. But, I think, with the new CBA and kind of the transition that teams have had to go to in terms of kind of figuring that out, and then figuring out their cap situation, figuring out their second apron issues, and really kind of the entire league figuring out like, hey, if you don't kind of take a broader view of how you're structuring your team from a cap perspective, you're going to end up getting stuck with just a couple moves. And so I think that that's maybe kind of limited some of the Blazers' options. I think they probably have some guys who, they probably wouldn't mind, maybe getting some young players or picks from. But I just don't think those deals have materialized. And kind of to your point, I think it's fair to wonder too, like, are those deals going to materialize at this point? I think they probably will. But, it is hard to tell. And so I guess what I would say about that as well is that, I feel like they've done a pretty good job of straddling that line between development and also, again, having some more veteran players. And so, like, take a guy like Robert Williams, for example. Like a guy like Robert Williams, has had some injury issues. There's always rumors about like, well, obviously Rob doesn't kind of fit with the timeline. Are they going to move him? And, there's some merit to that. But also, if you're talking about like, oh, you'll get a second round pick, it's like, well, that's not worth it for the Blazers to do. It's like they'd much rather have that player in their locker room, on their practice court, and hopefully healthy and on the court at some point in time, rather than just getting another second round pick. Like I would say too, some of the deals that get thrown out there, like, look, guys, like it's probably just not worth the trouble to make a move like that. And so I think they're kind of in one of those situations where there's interest in some of those players, but maybe not as much interest as they would like in terms of the assets they're going to get back. Therefore, I think the team kind of views it as like, well, I guess we could do this deal, but it's kind of a lateral move anyways. Why wouldn't we just keep the player? So I think that's kind of what they've run them to the last couple of seasons in terms of asset acquisition with those veteran players.
Talking to Casey Holdahl, who covers the trail. I said who trails the Blaze, who covers the trail.
That works.
Who covers the Trailblazers, beat reporter and insider. To that end, Casey, let's talk about some of the young talent. Who would you consider, or who do you think that the Blazers front office considers, quote unquote, and we love to do this, untouchable? Who is untouchable on the Blazers?
Sure. Well, I mean, I always preface this question by saying, like, there's like 5 players in the NBA who are untouchable. Mm-hmm. I thought Luka Doncic was untouchable.
Right,
so, like it kind of makes you reevaluate what the word even means when things like that happen. So, like, anyone on the Blazers could be had for the right price. I mean, let's just be straight up. Like, when you're a team that's in the place that they're in right now, like, you don't get to be so discerning that you'd be like, oh, no, we wouldn't move this guy. But I will say that players like Deni Avdija, players like Toumani Camara, I think players like Shaedon Sharpe, players like Donovan Clingan, I think particularly they're young guys who they like, you'd have to come in with something pretty nice to even kind of get a conversation there started. I see Deni get thrown out there a lot because he's had a great season, and I think people look at him and assume that like he's a little bit too far along in terms of where the Blazers are in the rebuild. I would disagree with that. He's younger than Toumani Camara, who is a second-year player who they also really love. Like a guy like Toumani, again, a second-round guy, has really hit getting him in that trade from the Suns. A guy who has, I think, all defensive team, all NBA defense opportunities. Like those, you're going to have to come in pretty high in order to move those guys because they really like those guys. They consider them cornerstones. And so if you're going to go out there and make a move, and those are the kind of players you're interested in, you're going to have to do a lot to get them. Same with the thing with a guy like Shaedon Sharpe. He had a little bit of an injury problem at the beginning of the season with his shoulder. He's played through it all season long. A guy who they're really excited about. And then a guy in Donovan Clingan, first year, I think they really like what they've seen out of Donovan. Getting better defensively has been something they've talked about for the last decade. Hasn't really happened. I would say until this season, Chauncey's really got this team to a point where I think they're starting to understand what they're being asked to do on defense, and they've gone out and made some moves from a personnel perspective that have kind of put the emphasis on defense. Mm-hmm. So they have made some strides there, and I feel like they view Donovan as a guy who can be a long-term kind of 10, 15-year rim-protecting vet. So, I think those are the guys who, they're not untouchable. There's no one on this team that's untouchable, but who the team really likes and has no interest in moving unless you're going to show up and plop something on the doorstep like Luka, that ain't going to happen. But like that's the kind of place where I would say those 4 guys those are players they view as long-term pieces for this team. Ergo, they're not going to move them unless it's something that makes a whole lot of sense for the Blazers.
Well, Casey, when I asked this question, how safe is Chauncey Billups out here in Sacramento? You could sign a deal and be fired before the ink dries. So I'm going to ask the question anyway. How safe is Chauncey Billups?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think to your broader point, who's safe in the NBA in terms of coaching? Like, it is a hard business out there. So when I first got into the business, I worked with Nate McMillan, and I remember Nate said something to me, I was 23, 24 years old, and some coach had gotten fired that I think Nate was close with, and I was like, boy, that's really a bummer. And he's like, yeah, it is, but he's like, we're hired to be fired. Like that's why they bring us in, is to have someone to blame when things go bad. So as far as Chauncey is concerned, I think he's done a really nice job this year. I think that, I think everyone's probably getting evaluated at the end of the season. But I think that Chauncey has really grown as a coach, going from having kind of one assistant year under his belt when he first got the job. But, I'd say it was a bit of a rough transition at times for Chauncey, but he's really made a lot of progress. Love playing for him. And I feel like he's done such a good job of, being a former player And I think maybe early on in his coaching career, like he may be a little too hard in terms of like thinking that because he was a former player, he can maybe say some things to former players and they would take it a certain way. You know, today players just aren't necessarily always like that, but I feel like Chauncey has really found a good lane in terms of understanding what a young player needs to hear while also not alienating that young player, which is, you know, a real issue for coaches these days. You know, you don't want to lose a guy and then, you know, next thing you know, his agent's asking for him to get sent somewhere else. So I think Chauncey's done a great job. I think, you know, any kind of trying to figure out what job stability or safety is in the NBA is a fool's errand because things can change from day to day, as you well know. But I think Chauncey's done a really nice job, and I think that he's got a whole lot of things to point to this season to say, like, hey, you know, maybe it was a little, maybe I got the job a little too soon, but I think I've earned it. I've been here. So, you know, I think it could go either way. Beginning of the season, I think a lot of people assumed that this was kind of it for Chauncey. The way the team has played this year under him, I'm not so sure. I think there's a good chance that he will be back. But again, it's hard to make any kind of definitive statements about those things because, you know, it's just tough. And there's also there's also going to be some openings out there this year, I would imagine. And, you know, it kind of cuts both ways, you know, like sometimes, you know, you want to bring a guy back and maybe he decides, hey, if I have options, maybe I'll explore those things. So I think that, you know, it can go a lot of different directions, but I mean, I've just leave it off to say that I think Chauncey's done a great job. I think he's earned a lot of respect from people that maybe didn't respect him before.
It is a two-way street, Casey. We know that for sure. Casey Holdahl, who covers the Blazers, beat reporter insider. Casey, thank you so much for joining us. This was great. We're in the Western Conference, so we'll have to have you on again.
I'm always around, Allen.
All right. Thanks so much, Casey. We'll talk to you soon. On the other side, great stuff from Casey. On the other side, we haven't